Hey, everybody. Here we are. At least I'm in Philadelphia. And we have a few people joining us. Oh, Max just joined us from Chicago. Hi, Max. How are you? Good to see you. It's week
Morning,
7.
Al.
Hey, good morning. It's week 7. We are very excited. Lots of us are fans of the various aspects of the New York school. And we would love to get your calls about the poems of this week, or really any topic that interests you. The number is 610-616-3208. 610-616-3208. Please give us a call. Don't hesitate. We're very friendly. We're very nice. You can Skype us if you prefer at ModPo Pen, one word, ModPo Pen, Penn. So I want to say hi to my pals. Shout out to two shout outs, and we'll be ready to talk. Anna is going to be following the discussion thread, which is in the ModPo site. The link has been widely shared, but if you can't find it, just click on resources, then click on webcasts, and you'll be able to see the thread there, or you can just go to the discussion forums and click on webcasts there and get right to it. I think it's pinned. Lily is going to be looking at Twitter, and the hashtag is ModPo Live. Allie is going to be following comments that get posted to the ModPo Facebook group. And if you haven't been there in a while, but Facebook is an okay thing for you, you just go to Facebook and you type in ModPo, and the ModPo group will come up. And Allie has already posted a link there for gathering the comments, but Allie will also be looking generally at comments on that page, see if they're relevant to the discussion we're having live. And Gabe is going to be looking at the YouTube comment feed. Thank you, Gabe. Hi, Davey. How are you? Good to see you.
Hello, Al. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really good. Thank you. And Gabe, hi again. And Anna, hi again. And Jess, how are you?
I'm hanging in there, Al.
Yeah, okay. We can't expect any better than that. That's good. Allie, hi. How are you? And Max, again.
Morning, Al.
Good to see you. And Chris and Zach, thank you once again at the beginning and at the end for doing amazing things. I think Chris picked up a couple extra guitars this week, so it's all like, it's the wall of sound over there at his place. Yeah, 2 shout outs before we get started. One is to Tejas Suresh, whose thread caught my eye. The thread is called "The Closer You Look, the More You Find." The closer you look, the more you find. And I really like that. I like that as an idea. Of course, people who've been around ModPo a long time know that I and we admire that concept, which implies that the essence of close reading is as a practice is something like close listening or paying close attention or looking at something until it begins to start to resolve itself. It's akin to taking things patiently, slowly, wide-eyed from many angles. And I just like the idea. Thank you, Tejas, for putting it that way. The closer you look, the more you find. I mean, if that's true, why wouldn't you keep looking? Because you're going to find more. So you can look at the same things, the same phenomena, the same people, the same landscape, and see new things in it. It's kind of an amazing application of what we do here. And second shout out more generally to the CTAs. We haven't really said enough about them. The community TAs, they are volunteers. They are so committed. They're ModPo community members. They have connections between and among themselves and among newer or less resolutely involved ModPo people. The CTAs are the best. They make the whole thing work. They're the ones who lead the way during the peer review week. So thank you to the CTAs, and I know many of them are watching today. All right, so the number is 610-616-3208. I want to begin by tossing out a question, and my friends here had no idea I was going to do it. I'm really curious about what we make of the final 2 lines of John Ashbery's poem, Some Trees. We've talked about that poem at great length. We haven't maybe in recent years because we spent there's so much focus on it in the early years. It's kind of an anthemic poem. It's a lovely poem. It's a poem for all occasions. But the last two lines, I will read the last stanza, but I'm curious, starting with Gabe, what you make of the last two lines. And by the way, do they speak to us? Speaking of the closer you look, the more you find, do they speak to us differently, uniquely and specifically right now? So I'll read the last stanza of Some Trees and ask Gabe to start with the last two lines. And glad not to have invented such comeliness, we are surrounded, a silence already filled with noises, a canvas on which emerges a chorus of smiles, a winter morning, placed in a puzzling light and moving. Our days put on such reticence, these accents seem their own defense. So the lines I'm curious about, Gabe, are our days put on such reticence, these accents seem their own defense. And following Gabe, I'm curious to hear what Anna thinks of those last two lines. So Gabe, take it away. What do you think?
Yeah, I think with lines like these, I can only probably populate with questions more than give direct answers. But I'm wondering like what it means for a day to be hesitant, like reticent, reserved, hesitant. And I think of like the noise populating a kind of ordinary day, right? Like that's what it seems like. The silence is kind of filled with noises. I don't know. I'm just curious about these lines because I think they like describe a relationship to time that is like really quite interesting. And then I think you are connecting to the contemporary moments. I'm also kind of thinking about stillness and kind of days seeming similar to each other, but having an internal geometry that's a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right there.
And these accents we've always taken, people who read Ashbery closely, critics, and certainly in ModPo, we've always taken that to be a metapoetic reference, that it refers finally to the poem as it's kind of painted on the canvas of the paper it's written on or typed. And if these accents seem their own defense, it suggests a kind of autotelism, a kind of a 1950s style attitude that the poem is what it is, and that everything you needed to know about it you would find right there. That's the new critical autotelism. So these accents seem their own defense. It's kind of like a slightly slanted, somewhat satirical poke at the literary critical education that this sophomore or junior at Harvard was getting at the time. But at the same time, Gabe, as you point out, our days don't suggest that they are spent entirely in the poem. Our days strikes me, at least, as referring externally to the world around it. Yeah. And so that's the hard part of this. Our days put on such reticence that the autotelism is reinforced. It's very hard. Anna, what do you think?
Yeah, I've always read that to be, and your point about Ashbery writing this poem kind of in that sort of new critical moment, like reinforces this for me. When I was a young person in school, the way I learned to like read and scan poetry was by literally like doing like a scansion on a line, like marking the accents, marking the stresses and the beats, like of the actual poem.
Yeah.
So I wonder if maybe these accents seem their own defense is a way to kind of think about accents as in like a speech act, like an act of speech, but maybe also as an act of that kind of engagement with the poem. Like, I don't know how useful like scansion is anymore, like as a skill. I don't know how many people really still do it, but I think the idea that like to perform a kind of engagement with a poem that's literally marking it on the page, like yourself as a reader, like whatever that means for you, that might be a kind of invitation that Ashbery is giving us to not just read this poem, not just speak this poem in whatever accented speech you possess, but to also literally mark it yourself.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both. Chris, I think we have someone on the phone. Who is it, please?
We do, Al. We have our friend Tan on the line calling.
Oh, great. That's great. Tan, can you hear me? Hello, Tan. Chris, I'm not getting audio. Are you?
I am. Give me 1 second. Hang
Okay,
on
Chris.
there, Ton.
Chris, do your magic. Just to warn my buddies, I'm going to share a screen with some excerpts that we shared with our students yesterday, examples of I do this, I do that. And when we bring Ton up, I thought I'd share the screen and then we could review some of the I do this. And I'd like to ask generally what you guys think I do this, I do that achieves, accomplishes, what effects it creates. Ton, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me now, Al?
Yes, absolutely. It's great to hear your voice. Ton, I don't know if you heard what I
Wonderful.
just said, but I'm going to share a screen, and I assume you're looking at a screen big enough to be able to see the words. I'm going to see if I can get those words to be big. I'm going to share the screen and then read a couple of examples of I do this, I do that from the New York School, and ask Davey, Lily, and Ton to comment in any way they like about the effect of I do this, I do that, thinking that some people watching this webcast won't be used to that. It's a kind of a thing. It's a hallmark of the New York School, and it's new to our course roughly. So I thought it might be interesting just to look. So here's the screen shared, if I've done it right. Can you see that pretty well?
Not yet, because the stream is a little bit on my computer. So,
okay.
But I think I will be able to.
All right, Davey, can you see the screen share pretty well? Okay, I'm just going to read a couple of these samples. O'Hara, classic. It is 12:20 in New York, a Friday, 3 days after Bastille Day. Yes, it is 1959, and I love that. Yes, 1959. And I go get a shoe shine because I will get off at the 419 in East Hampton at 7:15 and then go straight to dinner. And I don't know the people who will feed me. I walk up the muggy street beginning to sun and have a hamburger and a malted, all present tense. Here's Hanif Abdurraqib in USA versus Cuba, which is a poem that's relatively new. It's certainly new to the main syllabus. This is the beginning in homage to O'Hara. It is 3:15 on a Saturday, and I am in a car on I-95 on the way to the soccer game, and Nate is riding shotgun, which is also the name for when you plunge something sharp into a can of beer and split open its aluminum shell before swallowing its urgent sacrifice. And I once saw Nate do this 5 times in one night before the Mount Union game. And we got to the field late the next morning, and it was almost as hot then as it is right now in the traffic that isn't moving. I'll just do 2 more. I really like Guests 20. It's not classic I do this, I do that, but close. Sleep is 20. It certainly isn't 20 sheep. There weren't that many in the herd under the gold crest of Sierra Nevada. It's more like 20 Madison Avenue buses. While I go droning away at my dream life, each episode is important. That's what it is. And finally, Bernadette Mayer, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. When it's time to go to bed, there's still a few hours left to read. I'm dreaming twice as much as before. I spend all my new time lying in bed thinking, last night I saw Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and tonight when I came into my room to go to work, I found an old seed pod on the floor by my desk. In the movie, you see one of these. If you see one of these, it's time to die. It's time to write some letters. Okay, so Davey, Lily, and Ton, I would love to hear any observations you have about I do this, I do that. Starting with Davey, please.
So we had a little bit of this conversation yesterday in my office hours, and 2 of the students, so I think as we mentioned before, several of us are teaching the credit-bearing version of ModPo at Penn with Penn undergraduate students. And 2 of those students, Kira Lucas and Sophie Nadell, came to my office hours yesterday and were asking me about I do this, I do that. And the conversation we had is that part of what the I do this, I do that sort of accumulative or like sort of listy format offers us is the ability to inhabit multiple identities simultaneously. So for Bernadette Mayer, mother and poet and partner all at once. For O'Hara, friend and colleague and consumer and queer community member and pedestrian and poet all at once. And that part of what I do this, I do that gives us is that in accumulating different thoughts, activities, features of quotidian life, it helps us assemble how different identities come together in our lives in a way that's simultaneous, in a way that might be thought of in other poetry or in other ways of thinking as isolated identities, that they really accumulate and layer on top of one another in the New York School poems and in the I Do This, I Do That format.
Wow, that was great. Thank you, Davey. That's such a great definition, modification of the usual definition. That's really great. Lily, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking almost cinematically that and I do this, I do that style of writing lets there be both a counter narrative and a larger narrative at the same time, so to speak. Like there's the person navigating the space, and then there's something going on, like the rest of city life or the rest of the family life going on as another larger space around the person's narrative. So we get to see O'Hara's New York City and more like know that there's more New York City happening that he's not seeing, because we know we're getting a subjective slice of it while he's encountering and bopping off of other things and people he's seeing, maybe sometimes in ways we like, maybe sometimes ways we don't like.
Lily, follow-up question. Does the use of the present tense aid and support that sense that you just described of this is a slice of what I'm seeing and there's a lot else that I'm not? Does present tense have anything to do with that?
Yes, I think so. Sorry, there's loud construction outside my window, if you can hear that. Yes, because it's almost like a tracking shot in a movie or a TV show. Like there's a motion to the present tense as the person is noting what's happening live, we are getting that live feed almost.
A live feed, I love that. Thank you. Yeah, live feed is a perfect thing. When we these days are using some kind of medium to get a live feed, we know, we're so conscious that there's so much else going on that's not in the live feed. That's really good. Hey, Tan, how are you?
All right, thank you. How are you doing?
We're great. I'm great. Do you want to comment on I Do This, I Do That?
Sure. I think that to riff off something that Lily said, or rather exactly what she said. When I was younger, I used to really love reading scripts. And what I Do This, I Do That really reminds me of is reading scripts when, first there is a protagonist or like a point of view, and then in the margins or somewhere like in cursive, it's also written what's happening around them or how they do what they do. And this is what it reminds me of, but at the same time, you are kind of both the surrounding and the narrator.
Mm.
So you are, to me personally, when I read this, it is as if I am both the city and the person.
Yeah.
But also, yes, something that you said about live feed, something that is happening at the moment of speaking, definitely also applies, I think, especially when you watch somebody like walk and, for example, talk to you as they walk. This is kind of what's happening, but it also kind of weirdly reminds me of letters.
Yeah.
Because when we write letters, or at least when I write letters, because this is what I've been doing in quarantine, I kind of describe what's happening and what I'm doing or what I'm reading or what I'm thinking, what's happening outside my window, whom I have been talking to. And it is as much of an autobiographical moment as a moment in conversation with somebody to whom it might be sent. So in a way, we are kind of almost readers of a letter and have a conversation.
Yes, yes.
At least this is how I read it.
So you're suggesting that I do this, I do that because of present tense and other aspects creates maybe a greater intimacy than...
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess I would put in as a footnote, an informational footnote, in English, and I guess it's true of French and Italian language, rise of novels, early novels. The present tense, because novels, when they really, as a genre, when they really came into being in the early 19th century and at their height in the mid 19th century, it was all third person, lots of omniscience, and always past tense. Right? But the idea at the very beginning, when you have some crazy writer like Samuel Richardson, who didn't know what the rules were, would write a book like Pamela, which is letters, and it's all present tense, which is absurd in the theoretical, in literary theory, just absurd that you could imagine some young woman working in upper middle class house saying, I am writing this to you now while Mr. Booby is chasing me around the house. It's a little hard to imagine that Pamela was willing to be chased around the house and was writing while she was doing it. And so but the original impulse of the novel was to write with that intimacy. And I think poetry, because it really can break all the rules so easily, begins to try to experiment with that intimacy at the time of the rise of the New York school. So that's really cool. Tan, say hello in another way before we ask you to hang up. Tell us more. What's going on? How's your reading? What of ModPo are you doing? How are your students?
Al, I'm all in my feelings about February, and I'm still in my feelings, and I don't think I will ever be not in my feelings about February, and I want to talk about that real quick.
Okay.
Because I remember last year we talked about this poem, and it was kind of like a revelation for me. But in a way, last year, this week was just like a week like any other. Every week we find something that is really a standout thing, and then we move on to the next week. However, this year, because probably of our confinement, and my family is currently quarantining because both of my parents have somebody at work who has COVID.
Oh, wow.
My window has become a very kind of like a fixture of my point of view.
Yeah.
And colors and what's happening outside of it has become very important. So, for example, when he writes, does it the light that makes the baby pink? Or is it the light that makes the baby pink? I remembered a moment when I have very light, kind of almost translucent curtains in my window. And so when the sun shines, it creates a very beautiful golden light. And I remember looking at it without being able to go outside, and I just got very emotional. But also at this particular point in time, I have been rereading Richard Siken's War of the Foxes.
Yeah.
And there's one poem which it occurred to me that I can read in conversation with February almost. And it is the way the light reflects, and it is a different poem in tone, but it treats the colors in the same kind of almost like a painter. Well, because Siken is a painter, and he writes, they see the man, but not the light. They see the field, but not the varnish. There is no light in the paint. So how can you argue with them? They're probably right anyway. And so if you read that in conversation with this particular line, is it the light that makes the baby pink? I have been thinking about whether, it is the light that makes the color, whether it is our point of view that makes the color, and whether our emotional response to it in the color or in us almost.
Yes.
So yeah.
Wow.
That happened. And
it's such a direct parallel to what Schuyler is doing in that poem, what you just talked about. I'm going to ask Allie and Jess to comment on a few lines of the poem, James Schuyler's February. But before you hang up, I just want you began this segment talking about February, saying something like, I'm feeling the feels. So can you summarize, hard to do about an emotion, but summarize what is it that's moving you so particularly?
Yeah, well, as a queer disabled person who is currently fearing for the life of my whole household, And without being able to go outside, I think that moment of catching the light and understanding that this is the way in which you will communicate with the world for the foreseeable future. And this is the light that you will see for the foreseeable future, or might not if something happens to you, and you never know if it will.
Yes.
And as a disabled person, you really never know if it will.
Ton,
That makes every moment like that significant and
Yes.
important
and
and apocalyptic in a way, but beautiful.
I'm sorry, the delay made me interrupt. I apologize. I asked that question with trepidation because, you know, I was asking about your feelings, and you answered so brilliantly and so powerfully, and I think in a way that just because even though you're describing yourself, reaches out to so many people. Just marvelous what you just said. Thank you. All right, so we're going to say goodbye, but I know you're going to, after you hang up, watch and listen to the rest of the webcast. Thank you, Ton. Thanks for being part of the community.
Thank you as well, guys.
When you look out the window, you'll see us waving at you. The window of your laptop.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
Tom.
very much.
Have a great day. Talk to you soon. Wow, Jess and Allie, I'm going to read a few lines from the James Schuyler poem and ask you to respond. And Davey, who's really responsible for Schuyler's super emergence in the chorus, is falling out of his seat with desire to say something. So I'm going to invite Davey to add something too, if you like, Davey, in response to Allie and Jess. Here are the lines, Jess and Allie. I can't get over how it all works in together. Like a woman who just came to her window and stands there, filling it, jogging her baby in her arms. So, Allie, do you want to say anything about that passage?
Yeah, I'm thinking about what Ton said and how in their current moment, that moment of kind of like greeting and recognizing the light is a way of being present in the world and present to their self, but also the other as in the world and the circumstances of the people they're caring for. And I think those lines actually kind of reflect that extremely well. I can't get over Scott, like he's in his feelings right now, right?
Yes.
How it all works together. Like a woman who just came to her window, there's the window again, and stands there filling it, jogging her baby in her arms. So it's the kind of parceling of those three entities, right? The woman who is taking it in, who in this moment is kind of a placeholder for the poet, right? The baby who is the other person in that moment, and the world who's kind of wrapping it all together.
Really well put. Thank you, Allie. Jess, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I loved everything that Allie just said. And I guess when you read those lines, I thought back to the lines from Ashbery also in this idea of the reticent day. And I think it kind of casts that passage from Schuyler, which I've thought a lot about, in a sort of new light, which is that the days sort of, they put on reticence, which is to say they sort of pretend, or they might seem at a glance to be sort of shy and reserved and at a distance, but actually they're overwhelming, like something as mundane, as ordinary, as like a figure appearing in a window. Like that is a moment that reveals just how overwhelming the days are and just how present they are. Yeah. So I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have much more to say other than that, which is just that moment does sort of, it just beautifully captures that sense of fullness that can happen.
Yeah.
In an ordinary moment, right?
Yeah. Thank you, lovely. David, do you have a quick thought to add to this?
Yeah, two extremely quick thoughts. One, part of the radical gesture of this moment for me is that this is urban renewal era New York. So this is a version of Manhattan that is being radically reconstructed. And I can't get over how it all works in together is a way of describing the city that really pivots away from that and thinks about forms of urban change other than asks us to think about urban change more expansively than thinking about a policy and planning oriented radical and structural remaking of the city, to think about what else changes. How does the quality of light change the city? How do my neighbors appearing in their windows change the city? How do we have a more full definition of what the city is? I also think about this as a moment of kinship. We think about Schuyler as being alone. We think about Schuyler as being isolated. And I really see this as a kind of kinship that the city affords. So we think about O'Hara, like encountering people on the street, remembering being in the club and seeing Billie Holiday perform. But I think that thinking about the kinship afforded between neighbors while they're in their houses, thinking about the house as not isolated and domestic, but part of the kinship network of the city is something else we get here.
Lovely. Thank you so much. I want to say hi to Jason, who's joined us after teaching. Hey, Jason. What I'd like to do is go around and ask Anna, Lily, Allie, and Gabe to tell us what's happening in the various comment modes. And what we'll do is we'll collect a few topics and we'll pick one that interests us. And Max, you'll be up first to respond to whatever the heck it is. So Gabe, tell us what's happening in the YouTube comment feed, please.
Yeah, lots of great chat. So some recent questions. Well, first of all, because Davey also sort of highlighted it in our own chat, Juliet Vandermolen suggested that maybe we can think of the New York schools style as a kind of close reading of ordinary life, just sort of an interesting proposition. And there was a good question, and I apologize that in the flood of the chats, I may not be able to find the person who wrote it, but there was a good question about, does I do this, I do that always have to be first person? And do we always trust that narration as a thing that was happening actually outside of the poem? This wasn't exactly part of the question, but I'm wondering about is there a fake I do this, I do that, or a simulated one, or things like that, which people answered Barbara Guest as a good kind of counter example. Yeah. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight is just a question that maybe could take a good sort of historical aside from you, Al, knowing that you know more about this period, is just the relationship between painting and poetry as practices at this period in time. So that's some of the stuff happening there.
Great, thank you. We've got 3 topics there. Lily, Twitter?
Well, Ton and Jeremy Dixon are holding down our Twitter presence today with 3 total tweets so far. Guys, don't forget, you can interact with us on Twitter, #ModPoLive. But Ton,
how's Jeremy doing?
Well, Jeremy has 2 great points that I'm going to bring up in a second, but I want to make sure we get out there that Ton has posted another very adorable photo of Katz, their dog, eating something maybe, or holding a toy. I don't know. Go check it out. Looking very groomed and very shiny and nice. But so 2 things that Jeremy said that I think are would be interesting to talk about. Jeremy, throwing back to Some Trees, says, I'm on the last 2 lines we talked about, I'm almost seeing a defense of the gay and queer sounding voice in terms of the freedom the trees provide. The sound doesn't have to be hidden as it does in the usual world of, quote, our days. So that could be an interesting topic to take up, the queer politics of our days. And talking about first person and I do this, I do that with Frank O'Hara. Jeremy says a live feed also means you are constantly in the present whenever you read, wherever, I guess, or whenever you read the poem. We are presently in New York with Frank. Like the present tense brings us to the present moment when we read the poem. So thanks, Jeremy and Tom.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Ton and Jeremy, very much. Okay, so let's turn to Anna. What's happening in the discussion thread?
Discussion thread is popping off right now. There's so many good comments. But I just want to highlight this one in particular from EB. EB writes, The I do this, I do that style makes me think of the way time can feel distorted. It feels particularly relevant in this year of COVID when quarantine days feel endless and yet whole seasons seem to disappear overnight. Particularly the day Lady died, there's such a focus on the minute by minute detail of what happens at lunchtime, and then it seems to speed ahead to the train and dinner.
Good. That's a good
I thought
one.
that was a really good comment.
That's a really good one. Okay. And Allie, what's happening in Facebook?
Mandana says hi.
Yeah.
We have a question and then a really great comment. So the question is from Larry Barak, who says, to what extent has the New York style influenced modern poetry in general? So maybe that's something we could try to answer. And then Ronald Keeperman says, I do this, I do that, strikes me as purposeful soliloquies, poetic memos to one's future self, prompting remembrance of one's past self, opening time and space to unfold oneself across past, present, and future. And that's lovely and really articulates a lot of what I love about this week of poetry.
That's great. I mean, it makes me think that the ModPo community, just their comments we could do a webcast, we could do a whole session just responding to these wonderful comments. Thank you all for being so engaged. Well, Max, I'm going to summarize a bunch of these topics, and I would like you to pick one, and we'll take it from there, and then I'll do the same with Jason. So, Max, close reading of everyday life. Does first person? Is there a trust problem with first person? Painting and poetry. Can we do a queer reading of some trees? We have actually, I think, at some point or other in our assessment of that. But Jeremy's asking for it. I think it'd be fun to do. EB's question about time being distorted in the time of pandemic. Larry Barak, what's the New York school influence today? Do poets today get something from it? And Ron Keeperman talks about I do this, I do that as soliloquies really for the future. Pick one of those, Max.
Well, if you will allow, I want to combine a few. Go with take the close reading of everyday life, the distortion of time, and what the New York school means at this moment. Try to kind of take that as a constellation and dig in a little bit. I like the idea of close reading of the close reading of everyday life, although I would say that the close reading of everyday life is also a way that we describe or could describe a lot of the poems in our syllabus. And perhaps then it's a way of understanding modernism very broadly. I mean, you can go all the way back to James Joyce's Ulysses, right? In a way, that's a close reading of everyday life. We could find more contemporary examples too. I think what the New York school is doing, rather than just close reading everyday life, is celebrating it in a way that's still different from the way that Whitman would celebrate everyday life. Celebrating it by bringing this dimension of action to it, of sort of commemorating very specific moments with this very specific moments in time of everyday life, using a very modern notion of time. This attunement to the clock, this attunement to the workday schedule, this attunement to train schedules, just using that as a way to bring a kind of shape to everyday life, and as a way to kind of atomize time in our days into perhaps more meaningful units. So I think that's, for me, that's sort of what the New York school is up to. And then that's sort of a way perhaps of also understanding how this is a transitional movement in our syllabus from the earlier modernist poets to the conceptual poets that we'll get to later. This increasing awareness of the modern conditions and eventually postmodern conditions that we live in, and how they can be brought to bear on our understanding of our surroundings, and how they can be brought to bear on form, and how we narrate what we do and what's happening.
Well done, Max. Boy, and you didn't have any notes. You combined three major questions into a beautiful response. That's a keeper. Thank you.
Thanks.
Gabe, I want to just throw something at you you didn't know was coming. If you think about, ModPo very, very, very artificially divides and organizes around movements, modes, and styles, and has a kind of implicit, but not very ultimately very helpful idea about certain influences. So the question would be, if we take something like imagism, which has had an effect on all poetic writing, or much poetic writing since then, in a mostly invisible way at this point. I mean, the image, right? If you take that, or you take the Dickinsonian, particular kind of Dickinsonian condensation that Laureen Niedecker mastered, or you take the language, our week 8, the language, the cracking of idioms, the introduction of comedy in the cracking of idioms, and the certain devotion to fragment as it becomes incompletion. You'd say that's all over the place, even with poets who reject much of what the language movement is doing. Would the New York school style stand a little above is the wrong word, a little more forcefully as an influence than some of the others, or is the New York school style just something that contemporary poets have taken? They've taken some cool experiments that they did and gone on and done their own thing, or is the New York school more influential perhaps than others? What a question.
Yeah, I'll say. You mean today, right?
Yeah, I mean today.
I do think that it is a bit of a bigger influence right now than some of the other schools that you're mentioning. I mean, I think language's weight is still really there. Less so imagism, definitely in an invisible way. I'm just responding to I think there was 11 clauses in that question, by the way, Al. So, New York school. I mean, I think what's influential about them is that there is I feel like the New York school is so intimate, and there's so much I don't like this word, but there's so much heart with relation to these ordinary things. It's actually a very sentimental school of poetry, I kind of think, but that takes that sentiment and approaches it from a kind of unexpected angle. And I think that's what makes people so attracted to it. If you look at, lunch poems, for example, there's so much just good sentimental love in that. You'll see a bunch of weddings where people read Having a Coke with You and, post it on their blogs and stuff like that, because the New York school poems can achieve that feels, but they do it in this way that I think is quite interesting, quite sort of surprising. And also I think the New York school is hard for us to talk about because it has its characteristic styles, but it branches out so much. I mean, Ashbery, there's some Ashbery that is worlds away from some O'Hara, and Barbara Guest worlds away, and Bernadette Mayer worlds away. So they have their characteristic things that let us group them, but that is a really splintering kind of school. Yeah. And I just think they're really kind of in right now, in a good way.
Thank you. That was not, the question wasn't really fair, but it was meant in a heuristic way to put that on the table for ModPo people to think about these, and also there's greater enthusiasm depending on the moment, the year, the sensibility of this group of ModPo as a collective toward one week or another. And the New York school, we're sitting at the edge of our seats thinking about its relevance, I think more than usual. Chris, there's nobody on the phone, I don't think, so I'm going to put the number out again. Then I'm going to ask Jason a question. So it's 610-616-3208. We'd love for you to call. There's a lot of people commenting in the various formats. We do understand why it's easier to just type a comment than to call, but we love hearing your voices. 610-616-3208, and you can Skype us at ModPo Pen. So Jason, Jeremy Dixon, I think Jeremy would just like us to go back to Some Trees briefly. We're going to do this briefly because we've already talked about Some Trees before you arrived, I think. What is a queer reading of Some Trees? What does it make for the poem? What does it feature? We certainly, there's certainly so much interesting you could say about it. And why ultimately, I'm going to ask Davey and Lily also to comment. Oh, I lost Lily. Okay, maybe her power went out. Wow. Okay, so I'm going
It
to
did,
ask.
Al, sorry.
That's
She's hoping to be able to
amazing.
come back soon.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Davy and Jess to comment briefly on this other question having to do with some trees, which is, and Davy, this is really I'm asking this truly, it's not a Socratic or even remotely Socratic. I've always wondered what we make of the speaker's decision to leave, presumably the town or city, to leave the village, to go to somewhere else, to meet someone. And is there a moving away from to a different landscape, to a landscape of trees? And what does that mean? And does it relate at all to a queer reading, so-called? So Jason, get us started. Don't try to do the whole reading, but get us started on a queer reading for Jeremy.
Is mic on? Yeah.
Yes, you're good.
I recall doing a queer reading, and I think that in a way that each line can be, I mean, the whole thing can be read as a kind of leaving of the queer outsider literally leaving and wandering outwards away.
In the sense of looking for someone?
Yeah, well, I mean, as though, I mean, to arrange by chance is a paradox. You can't arrange, I mean, you can arrange by chance in a certain way, but you can't determine the arrangement.
That's right.
So to meet as far this morning from the world as agreeing with it, you and I are suddenly what the trees try to tell us we are, that they're merely being there means something. That in a way the in a sense, I mean, there are, especially, I just taught a TV show in which this is so resonant, but basically, I mean, if we think of even a college campus or a small town where, especially at the time of this poem being written, where being queer is not allowed, it is kind of by chance, the necessity, like chance necessity, in the way that the trees are where they are.
Mm.
And kind of, I mean, kind of the outsiders who leave looking for more or for something else or for even the unknown are put themselves in the position of being able to encounter someone else in the same position.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah, it's fine.
Bring in Mandana, who's on the phone, and we'll keep going. Hi, Mandana. How are you?
Battery charging.
Mandana, can you hear me? Chris, do we have Mandana there?
should. Mandana, can you hear us? Mandana, can you hear us?
Okay, we're gonna call.
I'll try to get a hold of her.
I'm appealing to Mandana through the webcast to call us back. Because Mandana is so into Ashbery and has really thought about this particular topic. Jason, I want to come back to you, but I want to bring in Davey and Jess to add a couple points, and then we'll come back to Jason and maybe Mandana. Davey, I'm dying to hear what you think about this question of moving outward from a social space, maybe a community, to the trees, and whether this kind of is up your alley in the way you've been thinking things about it as a critic and theorist.
There we go. So one of our students in our credit bearing course came to my office hour yesterday to ask me pretty much a version of this question, which is, what would an eco-critical reading of this poem like? And the reason that I want to bring that in is that there's kind of, in queer studies 20 years ago, there was a lot of anxiety about, like, we really only think about queer people in cities. And queer people's lives, like many people's lives, are many, many different things. And the idea of the queer image, the image of the queer person in the city, is a really false image that is not representative of queer and trans people's lives. And there's lots of great work that thinks about what does a queer rural relationship look like. And there's also lots of queer work that thinks about what do queer relationships look like with non-human life. If we think about queerness as a relation to others, that is a kind of desire that exceeds heteronormative desire. What does it look like to have intimacy with non-human animals, with non-human environments? And the conversation that we had in my office hours is to think about Some Trees as a queer eco-critical poem, to think about kinship relations among trees as a kind of model for a desire for queer kinship. What does it look like to belong in a way that is outside of heteronormative belonging? And how do the trees become an actor in the poem rather than a backdrop? And maybe it's a mode of leaving the city to think about, like, I'm not finding a mode for queer desire and queer kinship here. What other kinds of kinship relationships can I find between non-human actors? What kinds of networks of life can I find that would make my desire feel affirmed? And I think there's a wonderful queer ecological reading to do of this poem. And I was so glad that Sophie Nadell, the student who asked me that question, asked me, because I think that, like, that's not quite how we've talked about the poem, but I really think that a queer reading of this poem is a reading about non-human kinship, because, like, that's what's happening here.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. I believe we do have Mandana on the line. Is that correct, Chris?
We do.
Hi, Mandana. Hi.
Hi, how are you, Al? How's everybody?
I'm great. We figured that if we talked about some trees, you would call. It was bait.
It's like calling Beetlejuice 3 times, right? I show up.
How much of what we've just said did you hear?
Very little.
Oh, okay. So
I just heard the tail end of what Davey was saying.
Okay. Well, what happened basically is that we collected some questions from the various fora, and Max did this amazing thing of taking, like, there were 7 questions. Max took 3 of them and combined them. And but there remained, among others, Jeremy Dixon's request that we do a queer reading of Some Trees, which I think Jeremy knows we did, but I'm really glad that he asked again, because Jason and then Davey added some thoughts about that. And what I want to do is turn to Jess and then back to you, Mandana. I want you please to think about the very first word of the poem, which Davey's point just now made me think of it in a completely different way. These are amazing. I always conceived of these are amazing as a fairly straightforward reference to the trees. It's our first introduction to the trees after the title. But I think Davey's done a great job of productively confusing. It's sort of a version of a pronoun. It's a they. They are amazing. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a kind of wow, I'm in love quality to the whole poem. I think it is a love poem in some ways. And instead of saying this person I just met is amazing, I'm so freaking happy to have met you here, however it happened. But it always struck me as a kind of fun Ashberian dodge to say not the person I met is amazing, the you that you touch, explain, and love, but the trees. And I think Davy has successfully broadened who they are in the poem to include a kinship with the trees. So I want to, after I hear from Jess, I want to turn to you about these. If you don't mind, you can just sort of shuck it off and say whatever you want about the poem because it's a free world. Jess, what are your thoughts? It is. I mean, this is a gift exchange. This ModPo is a gift exchange. You shouldn't be compelled to talk about any one word. Jess, what are your thoughts so far? And then Mandana, and then briefly Jason, and then we'll move on to a last question.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating discussion, and I certainly don't have the familiarity with the sort of past like queer readings of this poem, but I'm definitely on board with the sort of queer ecological reading, the sense of trees like offering a model of kinship or intimacy that's like very attractive in this moment. And I think there is something to be said for the stanza that I think Jason read out, this meeting as far from the world as agreeing with it, namely the world. That's like a queer structure of feeling, if there ever was one, like finding that distance from the world that allows you to actually inhabit it and to find intimacies within it. So that I was thinking about that, but then also this question of like the trees and getting out of the city literally. And I think like sometimes with Ashbery, it's like everything's so complicated that I wonder like, is the poem available? Are the trees available for a literal reading? Like, are they really trees? And I think they are actually. And I think like this movement away from a social space, an urban space potentially that like kind of goes against your own grain is really important. And I think that like we see the fit of the poet in the urban space, but we also see the discomfort and the awkwardness too. And so this just presents the sort of other side of that. Like what happens if you just leave that environment and go elsewhere? And it's quite lovely, actually. And
Lily,
I don't know. I'm sorry, just one other thing, if I may. I'm rambling on, but
no, you're doing great.
You know, Eileen Myles, a poet of this week, and there's a poem of theirs that I love that's not in the syllabus or even in ModPo Plus. Davey knows about this poem. It's called Edward the Confessor. And it has a line that encapsulates kind of a lot of what we've been talking about the New York school as a close reading of the everyday and thinking about what it is to inhabit the everyday. And the line is, or a series of lines, it's leaning too hard on the everyday. And I'm paraphrasing now, to be like a queer person or a gender nonconforming person in an urban space. So sometimes it's just too much. And so what would it look like to go into a different environment that's like a little bit more cushioning?
Yeah.
So,
that's lovely. That's lovely. Mandana, I know you're still there, and then I'm going to ask Jason to respond specifically to whatever Mandana says. Jess, if I were to reduce in a kind of, I'm teaching high school students what you just said, not that what you just said is unavailable to high school students, it totally is. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise, but a kind of rough restatement might be just when you think that self-exile is necessary in order to find what you need, you realize that you go to a place where there are already beings here. They're here. And they really are here, and they're being there. They're merely being there means something, and you begin to see that signifies, and that you don't have exile is not what you think it is. It actually moving away from one space. You walk into the open arms, as it were, of the limbs and branches of another set of beings who aren't moving. They're not migrating. They are where they are. Mandana, hi.
Hi.
What do you want to do? I invited you to say something about these are
Well,
amazing, but say whatever you want.
well, listening to all of you, I have a perspective that I don't think I ever had before about some trees, which is the fact that what we think we see of trees is really only a very, very partial view of it. It's what they deign to show us. The strength of a tree, the depth of a tree, the breadth of a tree is underground, which it isn't seen, although the roots all connect underground. But in terms of a queer reading of it, I'm wondering whether that might be another way of looking at some trees, in the sense that there's an underground relationship that isn't visible to the heteronormative eye, so to speak. And at least in this poem, Ashbery is very lightly touching on some of these things. And in the New York meetup last night, we read a poem by Frank O'Hara at the Old Place. And that is literally, it names people, it names things that, again, were probably hidden to most people's eyes in the 50s, but he wrote about them in a very public way. And my suggestion is that some trees is a very, very light-handed touch of that. But still, if you look at the tree itself, it's implying something grander. It's implying something that's been around a very long time before we even really see it. And I wonder if that's something that's kind of an interesting thing to think about.
It definitely is. It definitely is. Thank you for that. Jason, briefly on any of the points that have been made, and then I've got a final question for pretty much everybody. Briefly, okay. Everybody.
I have a very specific response to Mandana's question, which is a brilliant way of thinking about like the queer mapping of space that is known to queers but not to others, and especially parks, and especially like late night cruising in parks. Like I just looked up the Rambles in Central Park, which is a heavily treed area. And it says, since at least the 20th century, the seclusion of the Ramble has been used by gay men for cruising. In the 1920s, the large lawn at the north end was referred to as the fruited plain. And in the 1950s and 1960s, the Ramble was feared by many as a haven for antisocial persons. So the idea of kind of the unseen part of the tree, the interconnectedness of the roots, like there is a whole city overlaid upon a city that is inducted. So instead of what I was originally saying about like leaving the community and going outwards, that the simple inclusion of wooded parks,
yes,
within cities at night, which were not lit well, created perfect mazes of place for gay men to go and find each other.
Would you please write that? That is a great reading. I bet I wonder if it's been done before, but that is such a great reading of Arranging by Chance to Meet. Wow, wow.
I also wanted to say that the first word of the poem, these, is a queer spelling of trees.
I love it. Please write that. I know you're working on other books, but please write that. That's such a great reading. And I can only imagine what Jeremy is saying in Twitter. I assume that Jeremy is Lily appreciating what we're doing here, or?
Well, Jeremy's very busy making fun of me for having my laundry visible in my shot.
Oh God!
Which I'm going to edit for next time.
Shame on you, Jeremy. Okay, that's
no, it's okay.
All right. here's what I want to do. I want to do two things by way of concluding. First, and concluding, that's like a drawn out word here at webcast time, because we usually go 90 minutes and we're not near that. But I want to do two things. One is I want to, and Mandana, are you still on the line?
Yes, I am.
Would you stay on the line? This will be the first ever. I want you to do final words with all of us, okay?
Okay.
Okay, great. And you'll also get to respond to this second to last question. So what I want to do is share screen, and I want to put up a poem by Vincent Katz called On the Subway. And I want to read it. It's in honor of anybody who in cities where there are subways and other kinds of closed-in mass transit in the cold weather when windows are starting to be closed, or subways such as New York where most of the windows don't work. And it's a very difficult space to re-enter, but it's so vital to the workings of cities like New York and Paris and London and so many others. And in honor of those people who are trying it out, including some members of my family when they have to, on the subway. So I'm going to share screen of that. Let's see what happens when I do. Okay, I'm going to read the poem, and meantime, it's in ModPo Plus, so maybe someone in the Zoom will share the link, and maybe people on the social media platforms will share a link there if they can, for those who are participating. I'll read the poem, and then what I want to do is ask each of you super briefly, like one comment each, to just say something in response to anything that's going on here, okay? On the subway. If I think of something that happened, what was that something that happened between two people on the subway this morning on the way to work or wherever it is one goes early in the morning? As the day wears on, it seems it could be something one could talk about or not, certainly not do anything about. Not now that the moment has passed, that will only be something that lingers in the mind for a little while, then grows cloudy and wraith-like. It seems so distinct, something one could always remember. Okay, so I want to start with Allie. Really, I know we've never talked about this poem, and Anna and I did for a ModPo Minute, but so just anything you're thinking about this. Allie, you first. You're a New Yorker. How are the subways doing?
Yeah, this poem.
Sorry, Allie. Al, could you put the poem back up?
Yeah, there's a link to it in the chat. You want to do it that way?
Sure.
Okay. All right, Allie.
This poem gives me the feels because I've taken the subway a little, but not daily like I'm used to, and I really miss it. It's like one of the things I miss the most. And I think what's kind of amazing and thought-provoking about this poem is we don't really get a lot of indication about not necessarily the value of whatever this thing that happened was, this event, but we don't know the nature of it. This thing that happens between two people, it could be like a moment of like desire or kindness or violence. Like it could be so many things. It could basically be anything. And yet the poem leaves enough space to accommodate something, anything from a kind of like traumatic moment to a moment of, elation.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Anna's next, then Max. Everybody be real brief.
I really like the way that this just makes a poem out of the process of just trying to remember something or trying to think of something. It like makes actually a sonnet, because I just counted the lines and remember that it's a sonnet, makes a sonnet out of really like that like labored sort of like process of trying to just apprehend something. And I just think that's really beautiful.
Nice. Max, and then Mandana will be on deck.
I know this is a little bit more contemporary than our hardcore New York school poets, right? But I think that there's a wonderful nostalgia here, I think, for what public transit would have been like 50, 60 years ago, that there's this world of just casual interaction and a world, I'm going to sound like slightly techno reactionary or something here, but it's a world without smartphones. It's a world where people are not being distracted by devices, that there's actually this possibility for encounters here on the subway that just isn't really the case anymore. I'm sure that big fans of New York and the subway could, tell me I'm wrong. I'm sure that's true. But I think that, every time I'm on the L in Chicago, or if, taking the subway in New York, it's packed, it's crowded, and everybody's on their devices, everybody's distracted. There's this really demeaning like commuter thing going on where there just doesn't seem to be this possibility anymore for these kinds of interactions, or to have your eye caught by a stranger or something like that.
And do you think memory, Max, is affected negatively by that? Because this is a poem about trying to remember something that's ordinary.
Well, I don't want to double down entirely on my like anti-smartphone device thing here that I'm going on. So I'm not going to go so far as to say that memory or something, that we're losing our capacity to remember something. I don't want to go all that far, but I do think I just want to locate more of this kind of nostalgia, I think, that's happening in this poem for a world where these sorts of details were more captivating, or there was a possibility for these kinds of details to captivate us differently.
Great, thank you. Mandana's next, and then Gabe.
I've written the subway a little bit since the pandemic, but not a lot. So and what probably doesn't surprise anyone who knows me is for all the subway writing I've done, I meet people, I talk to people, I have conversations, which is kind of an anti-New York thing to be doing.
That you do that.
It's a shock. I realize that. So there's always the possibility in those days for me of incredibly meaningful temporary intimacies, where people tell you about they know they're never going to see you again, but within that moment, it's kind of that foxhole feeling of things that you share with people, and they share with you. And that's gone right now. The times that I've written it now, we're all masked. There's so much you can tell from, no one's even looking at each other in the eyes. And I have such a sadness for that. I don't know if the other will ever really return. So reading this piece, which is really rather beautiful, my sadness is not for a long time ago gone by, but 9 months ago gone by.
Yeah.
And I'm hard pressed to see it any other way other than my voice is catching, with a tremendous sadness of also thinking about a lot of people lost who probably rode those subways. So for me right now, this poem, there are a lot of ghosts in this poem.
Yeah, that is the fate of rereading a poem like this right now. Gabe, and then Davey.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be more technical than heartfelt, but I want to say that what I think I like about the end of this poem is the movement between the moment that becomes a sort of lingering memory, which becomes cloud-like or wraith-like. It's sort of like the movement between the individual and the crowd. And I think if I had to sort of draw my like analogy, it's sort of like the relationship between an individual memory and one's memory is like the relationship between the individual and the crowd that the individual is in. So that's all.
I love that. Thank you. Davey, and then Jess.
So the natural interlocutor of the New York School for me is a canonical work of sort of public city planning history, which is Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is a wonderful 1961 book against urban planning in New York, which has lots of problems, but is still super lovely to read. There's a million excerpts of it online if you're interested in it. And something that Jacob says about cities that makes them different is the kinds of tiny iterable contacts you have with people, where your urban space puts you in situations with people where you're like, have this like fleeting, immediate, disappearing kinship relationship with them, where they're not like a person you've never met, and they're not like your friend or family member, but they're in this like weird intermediary space. And for me, that's what this poem is about, is the like kind of like temporary, important, this is such a cute cat, Gabe, oh my goodness. kinship relation that you have with someone, and that those kinship relations that, like, if you see someone, if you're in urban space and see someone like have an accident or like get like a pedestrian gets hit by a bicycle, like you immediately run to help them. And that's like all like right under the surface of the city is people like being able, this is just the cutest cat ever. It's so cute. People being able to like jump in and help one another. And that's not quite happening, but it's like almost always about to happen. And that's a specific kind of kinship relation. It's like Schuyler looking at his neighbor in his window. People who are not people who are strangers, but also not people who who could become important, but also are important for their like unknown singularity to you. I think that like that's a really New York School feeling, and this poem is so good at expressing it. Thank you,
Davey. Jess, then Lily, then Jason, briefly, please.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add to what Davey said, because I think I've been thinking along the same lines, but one of the things I love about this poem, which is new to me, is that this idea of something is sort of wonderful in its opacity. And to me, that's just so much of what is missing from life right now, is being able to exit your own little sphere of activity and mundanity and go out and just see stuff that you can't really interpret, but that somehow, for whatever reason, seems really important. And like you might be able to remember it.
Yeah, and what you just said is such a great way of defining what the New York School is doing generally about the everyday. Lily, then Jason.
Something that I've been thinking about here is, I know we've talked about this in terms of memory, but I almost see this as Katz reframing riding the subway as like a collective dream. Like a dreamscape that's shared by everyone who's also navigating the city. And that really stood out to me, especially if you pre-pandemic commute to work in the morning or at a time when you're a little bit groggy and something really weird happens on transit, and then you get to work and you're like, why do I feel like I had a really weird dream or something before I got here? So that's just knowing the New York School tendency to also include dreams and dreamscapes. I liked this like translation of that dream landscape into a real life piece of urban transit network.
Thank you. And Jason, final thought on this one before we turn to final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, something that strikes me about this poem is the kind of almost mournful tone of how that this intimacy, like this intimate contact with another person, eventually kind of thins out and evaporates and becomes part of a blur of, in the city, millions of such contacts. But I think that this poem is now dated because of because our geo position is marked by our iPhones, and like you could go on the subway and like somebody who's queer could go on Grindr and find out there's another queer person looking to meet up 2 cars away, and they could end up meeting and getting married. So the strangeness of our proximity has jumped into a techno stranger space in which the question of the stranger and the nearby and the proximate is flipped around and not the same as it is in this poem anymore.
Yeah, I also think about the subway as a place where people took refuge from connectedness, which is a version of what you were saying and what Max is saying, and that this poem is kind of celebrating that. I have a final thought about this poem, and then I want to start with Anna for a final word for the webcast. I think this poem is it occurred to me as you guys were talking, this poem is a rejoinder to and a rewriting of Robert Frost's For Once Then Something. That's a poem about a person who has to, in the pardon me, fake Frost sense, has to go to some rural location, looks down a well, and is trying to get past modern narcissism, and then waits for the moment when the water in the well clears so that the speaker can see down to the bottom. There's a pebble of quartz, which might be the truth. And so there's this moment of clarity, and in it we have the problem of seeing truth through the clear water gets interrupted by clouds and wraiths of clouds. It's almost word for word what happens in this poem. And I think I prefer this because, first of all, it locates that search in the city underground instead of in this kind of bucolic, classic Frostian lyrical spot. This poem also reminds me of In a Restless World Like This Is, which we're going to talk about next week, very much so. That blur that Jason was talking about. And it also makes me very happy because the poem is kind of about the loose ties as opposed to the strong ties between people of family and loved ones, but loose ties are kind of what the world is made of. We've talked about that in relation to the ModPo community. All right, we're going to have final thoughts. Now, your final thoughts can be a shout out. It can be a poem we didn't talk about this week that you highly recommend that ModPo people look at. It could be something about next week, week 8, the language poets. Not chapter 9.1 of the course. So let's start with Anna, and then Allie will be on deck.
I just want to shout out to the incredibly lovely folks who joined us in the discussion thread for this week, because the conversation there was really fabulous, and people made such wonderful rejoinders to the conversation that was happening here. So if you haven't gotten a chance to check that out, I highly recommend that you do. There's some really good conversation happening there. And for my final word, Brian Early was in the thread was mentioning Ashbery's reading that he gave at the Writers' House in 2013 when he was a Writers' House Fellow. And so I found my library of my Ashbery collected poems from the Library of America edition. And I'm going to read Street Musicians for my final word, which is an elegy for Frank O'Hara.
Wow.
One died and the soul was wrenched out of the other in life, who, walking the streets, wrapped in an identity like a coat, sees on and on the same corners, volumetrics, shadows under trees. Farther than anyone was ever called, through increasingly suburban airs and ways, with autumn falling over everything. The plush leaves, the chattels and barrels of an obscure family being evicted into the way it was and is. The other beached glimpses of what the other was up to, revelations at last. So they grew to hate and forget each other. So I cradle this average violin that knows only forgotten show tunes, but argues the possibility of free declamation anchored to a dull refrain, the year turning over on itself in November, with the spaces among the days more literal, the meat more visible on the bone. Our question of a place of origin hangs like smoke, how we picnicked in pine forests, in coves with the water always seeping up, and left our trash, sperm, and excrement everywhere, smeared on the landscape to make of us what we could.
Thank you, Anna. That's John Ashbery eulogizing Frank O'Hara in a poem called Street Musicians.
Okay.
Thank you. Allie's next, and then Mandana.
There are just so many good poems this week that we didn't get a chance to talk about. I'm thinking a lot about USA v. Cuba by Hanif Abdurraqib, and also Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Bernadette Mayer, particularly as a kind of Halloween, beginning of November poem.
And presidential election poem, too.
For sure, yeah. So that's very relevant.
Fantastic. Thank you, Allie. Mandana, you met John Ashbery in person.
A few times, and I mumbled and fumbled and told him how much he meant to me, and I was cherry red, and he very kindly looked at me and nodded. as the gentleman that he was, and he said, "That's very nice." But so I was going to give a plug for next week's ModPo 2 poems, which are all really, really awesome. There's so many to choose from. But because of what Anna read, I'd like to read a poem that Frank O'Hara wrote to John Ashbery, and it's entitled To John Ashbery.
All right.
I can't believe there is not another world where we will sit and read new poems to each other, high on a mountain in the wind. You can be Tufu, I'll be Po Chui, and the monkey lady will be there in the moon, smiling at our ill-fitting heads as we watch snow settle on a twig. Or shall we be really gone? This is not the grass I saw in my youth. And if the moon, when it rises tonight, is empty, a bad sign, meaning you go like the blossoms.
Wonderful, Mandana. Thank you. That was a good audible you called. And thank you for hanging out with us and doing the final word. That's so great.
It's an honor.
Fantastic.
It's always an honor. Thank you.
Love you very much. Thanks for doing everything you do for the ModPo community. It doesn't go unnoticed, believe me.
And it's distinctly my honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day. Jess, followed by Jason.
Yeah, I already mentioned Eileen Myles, but I just want to shout out their poems in ModPo Plus this week, especially writing, which is wonderful. And it's a short poem, and it's a good poem for feeling stuck or like you can't do anything, which I imagine is a pervasive feeling among many folks these days.
Yeah.
So
fantastic. Thank you, Jess. Jason, followed by Max.
I just want to say, in terms of the subway, if you're intrigued by the New York subway, make sure you take the time at some point in your life to read The Descent of Alette by Alice Notley, which is a mythical rendering of the subway in the subterranean urban world.
Good suggestion. Thank you so much, Jason. Okay, we're going to go to Max, followed by Gabe.
I just want to say I really appreciated what Jason had to say earlier about the forms of connectedness that devices allow for on the subway and how it's sort of, there's a different sorts of possibilities there. I also just want to shout out the another Ashbery poem, which we didn't get to, Hard Times. I think that's, it's a little less like our canonical New York school poems, but it seems very relevant to our current moment. So definitely check it out.
Thank you, Max. Thank you so much. I think, was Gabe next, I think? Yep. Gabe, followed by Davey.
Yeah, I think I want to just bring up another aspect of the New York school that we didn't have much time to talk about. My cat is sort of like eating my hand on the side here. So I was going to talk about the place of celebrity in the New York school. Just very quickly, I want to say that the New York school, I think, really actively deals with the iconography of celebrities. And one of the things I learned from the scholar Richard Dyer is celebrities are these assemblages of marketing and performance and your own sort of passions and your psychological baggage and public information and private information and all this stuff that comes together in the shape of a person. And I think looking at a poem like The Day Lady Died, or a poem like Lana Turner Has Collapsed, really gets into some of how smart Frank O'Hara was about celebrity. And the New York School really holds an influence on things like the New Narrative movement, on contemporary writing, on contemporary poetry about celebrity. And that just is an aspect of the New York School's influence that we don't talk too much about, but it's a great thing. You were muted, Al.
Yes, weirdly, I was muted. Thank you, Gabe. And Davey is up next, followed by Lily.
I just want to amplify something cool that Padmasini Ramji said in the YouTube chat, which Padmasini offered us an invitation to think seriously about the role of pregnancy in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and to think about pregnancy as a form of body snatching, and to really think about that poem as a poem that is dealing with the work of gestational labor and the aftermath of the work of gestational labor. And I think we think about that reference, and intertextuality is something else the New York School is really good at, thinking about working with other media, movies, poetry, other books, etc. But I think that we talk about lots of different kinds of work that happen in New York School poems, and I just want to amplify Padmasini's comment to think about pregnancy as part of that work.
Fantastic. Thank you, Davey and Padmasini. Lily, you're up, and then me.
Something I'm thinking about with New York School this week is we often think about cities as this like mega concentration and extremely busy, overstimulating place. But a lot of the New York School poems that we look at least this week, aren't necessarily trying to create or recreate like a cacophony of sounds and things from the city. They're really slowing down, navigating a city down to like one person's path through the city. And just something I've been appreciating, because the city isn't feeling very big and loud and cacophonous in quarantine. So I've been appreciating, you know, living in the life of just taking one person's walk through the city kind of quietly.
Lovely. Great. Thank you. My final thought has to do with something that Ron Keeperman shared in my office hour this morning. Ron said he was curious as to how the various crises that we're enduring have affected, in my opinion, affected the way ModPo has worked and how people have participated in ModPo. And I don't have an answer. I have no way of assessing that, certainly not now. Clearly, the number of enrollments has doubled, so we're up to more than 51,000 people enrolled. Obviously, a smaller number of people have actually, logged in and participated. That's in the 30,000s. And then the number of people who are active is much smaller than that. Active in the sense that they leave traces. So we probably have to take some time to figure out what effect it's had. But I would say this. One would expect in a time of crisis either that people would see it as an escape and a refuge, period, and just get away from the things that are worrying us and bothering us and making us upset, or that they would bring it in and there would be more trolling or more people upsetting each other or more conflict. And I would say that neither is the case. And this has got to be borne out in some thinking that we do after this 10-week session as we move into the so-called SLOPO session. I don't think it's a haven or an escape or a refuge, though it is to some degree that, and it's also not a replication of the world's conflicts and tensions. That hasn't seemed to change the way we participate. There's just more participation, and I think it's somebody needs to really study this and not just ModPo, but other communities that are operating this way. How is it possible for there to be so many people gathered with so many different approaches and so many different attitudes and in linguistic and other cultural differences and generations, age and abilities? How could they make the place the same as it was, not a refuge and not a place to enact the conflicts of the world? Don't know how that happens, but I admire it. And I kind of think that it's an ideal trope for what classrooms can be in this moment, right? Not excluding what's going on that causes conflict, but not letting them disable us in the way that so many of the public forums have been disabled, such as the presidential debates and so forth. I want to go out by playing the aforementioned poem by Eileen Myles. The poem Jess mentioned, it's 20 seconds, and it begins basically saying that it's okay, It really is okay. I'm going to play it twice. And farewell to you for this week. We'll be back for the Language Poets next Wednesday. And that'll be great, week 8. So here's Eileen.
Writing. I can connect any two things. That's God. Teeny piece of Band-Aid, little folded piece of Band-Aid. I ran to the bathroom to see my face. Sometimes I don't want to see my face in the mirror. Sometimes I can't bear my thoughts. Sometimes I can't do anything, but that's okay. Band-Aid, book, God. That's right. Writing. I can connect any two things. That's God. Teeny piece of Band-Aid, little folded piece of Band-Aid. I ran to the bathroom to see my face. Sometimes I don't want to see my face in the mirror. Sometimes I can't bear my thoughts. Sometimes I can't do anything, but that's okay. Band-Aid, book, God. That's right.
Ton, Mandana, Chris and Zach, thank you for your support. Ton, Mandana, thanks for calling in. Davey, Allie, Gabe, Jess, Jason, Max, Lily, Anna, who had to leave. You guys are the best. I really wouldn't have wanted to talk about the New York school this week with anybody else but you guys. So have a great week. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.